The silk of her gown felt like cold water against her skin, a 20,000-pound garment designed to project an atmospheric portrait of absolute grace. At 75, Lydia stood on the balcony of her penthouse, looking down at the flickering lights of the city she had conquered through marriage. For 50 years, she had been the quintessential social accessory, the woman whose primary function was to validate her husband's position in the world of high finance. She remembered the identity trade she had made in her 20s, a choice between a struggling artist who made her feel alive and a rising executive who promised her security. She had practiced a ruthless form of loss aversion, terrified that if she chose love, she would be insignificant in the eyes of her peers. She had won the status but lost the soul, a transaction that had left with a jewelry box full of worthless gold and a heart that hadn't felt a genuine beat in decades. Every gala she attended, every strategic dinner she hosted, was a brick in the golden cage she had built for herself. She realized now that her marriage was not a union of spirits, but a financial topic that had been negotiated at the altar. She looked at her husband, Reginald, who was currently holding court in the drawing room, his voice booming with authority of a man who owned everything and understood nothing. He didn't see Lydia. He saw a component of his success, a piece of real estate that reflected his own brilliance. They lived in a state of shared loneliness, two actors in a fake life who had forgotten their lines but continued performance out of a desperate fear of the truth. Lydia recalled the early years of the salary trap, when the atmosphere of luxury was enough to distract her from the growing negation of her own desires. She had negotiated away her passion for painting, her curiosity about the world, and her need for intimacy, all in exchange for a title and an allowance that functioned as a bribe for her silence. She was a billionaire of empty poses, finally admitting that the gold in her marriage was a conductor of cold, not heat. She saw the hindsight in the way Reginald avoided her gaze. He was just as trapped in the status gamble as she was, but he lacked the vulnerability to admit that the prize was worthless. The memory of her 30th birthday hit Lydia like a physical blow. Reginald had thrown a party that was the talk of the town, a massive display of success that featured the elite of London society. He had given her a sapphire necklace that cost more than most people earned in a decade. But that night, as she stood in the center of the ballroom, she realized that she didn't know a single person in the room, including her husband. He had used her birthday as a strategic opportunity to close a deal, managing her presence like a marketing asset. She had avoided the loss of her social standing by smiling to the hollow applause, practicing an identity trade that left her feeling like a ghost to her own story. She saw the ironic trade in that memory now. She had the sapphire, but she had lost the identity of the girl who once dreamed of traveling the world with a backpack. She was a billionaire of useless provision, possessing the means to buy anything but having no desire left to use it. The salary trap had convinced her that luxury was a substitute for life, a lie that had stolen 50 years of her vitality. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. Lydia walked into her dressing room, the walls lined with mirrors that reflected her fake life from every angle. She looked at the racks of designer clothes, each one a uniform for a role she no longer wanted to play. She felt the urgency of her 75 years, the realization that the gamble was almost over and she was holding a handful of worthless gold. She thought about the identity trade she had forced upon her daughter, Clarissa, who was now following her footsteps, marrying a man for a position rather than his character. Lydia felt a wave of fear as she realized she had passed on a salary trap as a family inheritance. She had taught her to win but not to love, and the result was another generation of successful strangers. She saw the hindsight as a call to action. If she couldn't save her own life, perhaps she could save her daughter's before the golden cage slammed shut for good. She was ready to break the walls, to turn the secret fortune of her regret into a surprising revelation that would shatter the atmospheric portrait of their perfect, empty world. The grand ballroom of the Savoy was a swirling vortex of silk, champagne, and negotiated laughter, a place where the atmospheric portrait of success was painted in every expensive shadow. Lydia watched from a distance as a young woman, barely 25, accepted a toast from a group of financiers. The girl wore a diamond tiara that seemed to weigh down her very soul, Yet she smiled with a practiced negation of someone who believed she had just won the lottery of life. Lydia saw her younger self in that girl, a practitioner of loss aversion, who was trading her vitality for a seat at a table that would eventually consume her. She felt a surge of urgency to speak, to be the mentor reality that she herself had never had. She walked toward the young bride, the rustle of her own gown sounding like a warning from the future. "The gold doesn't warm the bed, my dear," Lydia whispered as she leaned in, her voice a hidden confession amidst the roar of the party. The girl looked at her with fear, then with the cold exclusivity of someone who hadn't yet realized that her status was a golden cage. She dismissed Lydia with a polite, empty smile, returning to the financial topic of her husband's recent merger. Lydia realized then that the salary trap is a seductive lie. It makes you believe you're the master of the house, while you are actually becoming the curator of a museum of regret. She returned to her table, where Reginald was discussing real estate values with a duke who looked as bored as he was wealthy. The ironic trade of their marriage was on full display. They were the golden couple of London, yet they hadn't shared a meaningful sentence in 3 decades. Reginald used authority as a shield against intimacy, and Lydia used status as a drug to numb the pain of her own identity trade. She looked at the centerpiece of the table, a sculpture of ice that was slowly melting into a puddle of useless provision. It was a perfect metaphor for her life. She had spent 50 years managing her reputation, practicing a lethal form of loss aversion that made her more afraid of social failure than of emotional death. She was a billionaire of empty applause, realizing that the salary she received in the form of luxury and prestige was actually a gamble she had lost the moment she said, "I do." She saw the hindsight in the way the candlelight reflected off her diamonds. They were cold, hard, and utterly indifferent to the silent nights she spent in a room full of worthless gold. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The drive back to the penthouse was a study in distance. They sat in the back of the limousine, the atmosphere between them thick with the negation of their shared history. Reginald was checking market data on his phone, his mind already in the next financial quarter. Lydia looked out the window at the ordinary people walking the streets of London, seeing a couple sharing a bag of chips and laughing under a bus stop. She felt a surge of jealousy that was more intense than any ambition she had ever felt. They had identity, they had presence, and they had a life that wasn't a performance. She looked at Reginald and saw a man who was broken at the top, a billionaire of technical data, who wouldn't know how to hold her hand if his life depended on it. He had won the world but lost the heart of the only woman who had ever truly known him. She realized that the salary trap had convinced him that security was a destination, when it was actually a prison of bricks that kept the real life out. She felt the urgency to break the walls, to find a way to tell him that at 75, she was tired of being a social accessory and was ready to be a human being again. Clarissa arrived the next afternoon, her face a mask of professional anxiety that Lydia recognized as the first stage of the identity trade. Her daughter sat in the Louis XIV chair, her designer handbag clutched like a weapon against the surprising revelation she was about to deliver. "Julian is leaving me, Mother," Clarissa whispered, her voice stripped of the status she usually projected. "But I can't let him. The scandal would destroy our position in the foundation. I have to negotiate a way for us to stay together, at least to the public." Lydia looked at her daughter and felt profound pity that was mixed with guilt. She saw the hindsight of her own choices being played out in the next generation. Clarissa was practicing loss aversion toward a fake life, terrified that if she lost the title of Mrs. Julian Thorne, she would become nothing. She was a billionaire of successful misery, just as Lydia had been for 50 years. "Clarissa, stop," Lydia said, her voice quiet but ringing with authority of a lifetime of failure. "You are trying to manage a tragedy as if it were a business opportunity. You are terrified of losing the golden cage, but you don't realize that the door is already open and there is no one inside." She pushed a box of old sketches toward her daughter, the drawings Lydia had made of the artists she had loved in her youth. "I spent 50 years practicing the identity trade for Reginald. I stayed for status. I stayed for the worthless gold, and I stayed for the salary of a comfortable life. And now at 75, I am a billionaire of regret. I have everything that can be bought and nothing that can be felt. The surprising revelation hit Clarissa like a physical blow. She had always seen her parents as the ultimate success, never realizing they were the ultimate warning. She looked at the sketches, the raw, authentic lines of a woman who was still alive, and saw the ironic trade her mother had made. If you are enjoying, remember subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. Lydia stood up and walked to the vast window overlooking Hyde Park, the atmosphere of the room shifting from negation to reality. She realized that by wait to live, she had negated her daughter's chance to see what a real life looked like. She had been a decision maker who had made every wrong choice about the financial topic of her soul. Clarissa, if you stay for the status, you're signing a contract of silence that will last the rest of your life. You will have the gold, but you will never have the love. Don't gamble your identity for a salary that the world will take back the moment you stop performing. She saw the fear in Clarissa's eyes, the fear of being ordinary, the fear of being alone. But she also saw a flicker of hope, a realization that success is a road to nowhere if it doesn't lead to sanity. Lydia was fixing it now, turning her secret fortune of regret into a mentor's warning that her daughter could finally hear. She was ready to be small in the eyes of society, so she could be whole in the eyes of her child. The departure from the penthouse was not a social event, but a quiet revolution. Lydia didn't call the movers or notify the publicity team. She spent the night packing a single suitcase with the things that held identity, the sketches, the old letters from her parents, and a few simple dresses she had bought in secret. She left the sapphire necklaces and the silk gowns in the walk-in closet. Worthless gold that belonged to a woman who no longer existed. She felt a surge of vitality as she walked through the silent rooms, the atmospheric portrait of her life as a socialite feeling like a discarded skin. She was practicing loss aversion toward her time now, realizing that at 75, every hour was an asset she couldn't afford to waste on fake poses. She left a note for Reginald on the mahogany sideboard, a hidden confession that was finally being made public. I am liquidating the golden cage, Reginald. I am going to find the woman I was before I met your status. I hope you find the man you were before you met your salary. She moved into a small, sunlit apartment in a neighborhood that Reginald would have described as insignificant. It was a place of real life, the smell of street food, the sound of neighbors arguing, and the atmosphere of a world that didn't care about titles. Lydia spent her days painting, her hands finding the rhythm of her identity. After 50 years of cool to brush, the colors were more vibrant, the lines more authentic, because they were no longer being drawn for a strategic objective. She was a billionaire of simple truths, finally knowing her own name without a title attached to it. She felt a sense of identity retrieval that made the penthouse seem like a prison of bricks. She realized that success is the ability to walk down a street and feel like you belong to yourself, not to a brand or a position. Reginald visited her after a month, his executive coldness, struggling with the surprising revelation of her new life. He sat on her small second-hand sofa, his tailored suit looking like a uniform in a world of authenticity. He didn't come to argue about the financial topic of their divorce. He came because the silent nights in the penthouse had finally become too loud to bear. "It's empty, Lydia," he whispered, his voice stripped of the authority he usually projected. "Without the social accessory, I'm just a man in a big house with a lot of worthless gold. I don't know who I am when I'm not winning." Lydia looked at her husband and saw the ironic trade he had made. He was a billionaire of technical data who was a pauper in the currency of the heart. You have to stop trying to manage your life, Reginald, and start living it. You are a successful stranger to yourself, and the only way to find your way back is to reclaim your heart today. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The final phase of Lydia's rebirth was a reconciliation with the memory of the life she had almost lived. She tracked down the artist she had loved in her youth, only to find that he had passed away years ago. But he had left behind a legacy of authentic work, paintings that were sold in small galleries and held in the hearts of people who valued spirit over status. Lydia visited an exhibition of his work and saw her own identity in the portraits he had painted of her 50 years ago. She saw the hindsight in the eyes of the girl on the canvas, the girl who hadn't yet been swallowed by the salary trap. She wept not with negation, but with total acceptance. She realized that while she had lost the years, she hadn't lost the soul. It had been waiting for her, buried under the worthless gold, ready to be reclaimed the moment she was brave enough to be small. She spent her final years as a mentor reality for young women in the city, teaching them to stop trading your soul for salary and to be honest about the financial topic of their hearts. She told them the truth about the golden cage and the empty homes filled with luxury. She showed them the hindsight of a life spent waiting to live. She was a billionaire of authentic presence, finally understanding that the only asset that survives the transition to the grave is the love you gave and the truth you lived. She saw the ironic trade in the world around her, the millions of people still practicing loss aversion toward a fake goal, and she became a voice of authority for the ordinary life. She was 75 years old. She had married for status and lost her life, but she had found her soul at the edge of the end. Clarissa eventually followed her lead, liquidating her own fake life and finding a real life as a teacher in a small coastal town. They spent their summers together, two women of identity retrieval who were finally rich in spirit. Lydia looked at her daughter and saw the hindsight in her smile, a smile that was authentic, present, and free. She realized that success is the ability to walk through your own front door and feel like you've arrived. She was a 75-year-old woman who had finally won the gamble by realizing the status was a lie and the home was the person you are when no one is watching. She breathed in the air of the city, a billionaire of simple truths, knowing that the salary was gone, the position was dead, and the gold was liquidated. And for the first time in her life, she was truly success. Stop trading your soul for a salary. Don't gamble your life on a future that doesn't exist. Reclaim your heart today. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The walk-in closet of the penthouse was a 30-foot corridor of cedar and velvet, a vault of identity, where Lydia had stored the various versions of the woman she was supposed to be. She stood among the rows of fur coats and silk gowns, each garment a financial topic that had been purchased to signal her husband's authority to the world. She touched the vintage Dior dress, remembering the night she wore it to the opera house. She had spent 4 hours being groomed by professionals, practicing the atmospheric portrait of the perfect wife, while her mind was miles away, wondering she had forgotten how to breathe without a corset. She had practiced loss aversion toward her social standing, terrified that if she appeared less than flawless, Reginald's executive presence would be undermined. She had won the best dress list but lost the sense of touch, a trade that left her feeling like a porcelain doll in a house made of ice. She realized that these clothes were not her possessions. They were her uniforms in a salary trap that paid in prestige but charged in soul. She saw the hindsight in the mirrors. At 75, she was surrounded by a secret fortune of fabric, but she was naked in every way that mattered. She pulled a hidden suitcase from the back of the closet, an old leather bag from her university days that smelled of dust and authentic memory. Inside were old charcoal sketches, the lines now faded but the identity they contained still vibrante. She remembered the days she had negotiated away her art. Reginald had told her that hobbies were for people who didn't have positions to maintain. He had convinced her that her creative vitality was a strategic distraction from the goal of their shared success. She had practiced negation of her own talent to ensure his professional momentum remained undisturbed. She saw the ironic trade in those drawings. She had the ability to capture the soul of the city on paper, but she had spent 50 years being a static object in someone else's gallery. She was a billionaire of useless provision, possessing the world's finest pens, but having nothing left to say. She felt the urgency to fix it now, to take these sketches and run before the worthless gold of the penthouse swallowed her final years whole. She was ready to be small if it meant she could finally be real. If you're enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The final dinner she hosted was a masterpiece of social negation. The table was set for 12, the titans of the industry and their social accessory wives. Lydia sat at the head of the table, the worthless gold of the cutlery gleaming under the chandelier. She listened to the men discuss market volatility and capital management, their voices a drone of technical data that held no room for human value. She looked at the women across from her, seeing the same fake masks she had worn for decades, the practiced nods, the empty smiles, the identity trait visible in their tired eyes. She realized they were all successful strangers to themselves, trapped in a golden cage, that they were too afraid to leave because of a salary of status. She felt a surge of identity retrieval as she stood up mid-meal. She didn't make a scene. She simply took off her diamond earrings, placed them on the table next to her untouched wine, and walked out. She saw the shock in Reginald's eyes. Not a shock of concern for her, but a shock of social fear for the embarrassment she was causing. He was a billionaire of public image, who was finally seeing the rebellion of the heart. The first night in her small, sunlit apartment in the city's creative district was a sensory shock that Lydia hadn't anticipated. There was no security detail, no staff to anticipate her every need, and no atmospheric order to maintain. The walls were thin, and she could hear the music from a neighboring flat, a raw, pulsing sound that felt like life itself. She felt a surge of fear, the loss aversion of the ego screaming that she had made a financial disaster of her life. But as she sat on the floor and opened her old sketchbook, the fear was replaced by a profound identity retrieval. She was no longer Mrs. Reginald Thorne. She was Lydia, a woman who knew how to see the world. She realized that the salary trap had been a road to nowhere, a 50-year detour from her own soul. She was a 75-year-old billionaire of second chances, finally understanding that success is the ability to be alone with yourself and not want to leave the room. She breathed in the air of the city. It was thick with exhaust and noise, but to her, it smelled like freedom. She spent her days exploring the ordinary life she had avoided for so long. She sat in crowded coffee shops. She walked to the public parks, and she watched the people who were rich in spirit despite their lack of financial topics. She saw the hindsight in the faces of the young women she met. They were all currently gambling their time for a salary or a title, believing that luxury was the destination. She wanted to be a mentor of reality for them, to show them the golden cage before they walked inside. She began to volunteer at Community Art Center, teaching the wise hindsight of her own regret through the medium of charcoal and paint. She was a billionaire of authentic presence, realizing that the asset of her story was the only thing she had left that was worth sharing. She saw the ironic trade in the eyes of the young artists. They wanted her old success, while she only wanted their current vitality. She was fixing it now, turning the worthless gold of her past into a social investment in the future of others. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. Clarissa visited after 2 weeks, her executive presence, crumbling the moment she stepped into the small apartment. She looked at the simple furniture and the stacks of sketches, and she wept with the surprising revelation of her own fake life. "Julian is still calling the lawyers, Mother," she whispered. "He says I'm being irrational and that I'm liquidating the family reputation. But when I'm in that house, I feel like I'm suffocating. I look at the gold, and I just see the bars." Lydia took her daughter's hand. The identity trade finally being dismantled between them. "The bars are only there if you believe the salary is worth more than your breath. Clarissa, I spent 50 years waiting to live, and all I found was a mansion of shadows. Don't wait until you are 75 to speak up. Don't gamble your life on a future that doesn't include your own heart." They were two women of identity retrieval, finally understanding that success is a useless wealth if it leaves you a stranger to the people you love. The final confrontation with Reginald happened at a neutral location, a quiet park bench far from the atmospheric pressure of their old world. Reginald looked smaller than Lydia remembered, his authority stripped away by the absence of his social accessory. He spoke of financial topics, estate planning, and the public image he was trying to salvage. He was still practicing loss aversion toward a world that had already moved on. Lydia looked at him with a wise hindsight that was both compassionate and firm. "Reginald, you are trying to manage a ghost. The woman you married for status died the moment she walked out of that ballroom. I'm not an asset in your portfolio anymore. I'm a human being who finally knows her own name." She saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of a man who realized that all his millions couldn't buy a single hour of the life she was now living. He was a billionaire of worthless gold, standing at the edge of the end, finally admitting that he was alone at top. "Is it worth it, Lydia?" he asked, his voice a hidden confession of his own doubt. "The ordinary life? The insignificance?" Lydia smiled, a smile of total acceptance. "It's not insignificant, Reginald. It's real. I spent 50 years being a shadow in a palace. Now, I am the sun in a small room. I have won the identity that the salary trap tried to steal from me. I am finally success." She walked away from him, the identity trade finally settled. She didn't look back at the limousine or the worthless gold of her old life. She walked toward her small apartment, a billionaire of simple truths, knowing that at 75, she had finally broken the walls. She was home, and for the first time in her life, the home wasn't empty. It was filled with the atmosphere of her own identity. Stop trading your soul for a salary. Don't gamble your life on a future that doesn't exist. Reclaim your heart today. The legacy Lydia left behind was not a foundation or museum wing. It was a surprising revelation that traveled to the whispers of London society, a story of a woman who had married for status and lost her life, only to find again in the ordinary. She became a voice of authority for the mentor's warning, reminding everyone that gold is a conductor code if it isn't shared with love. She saw the hindsight in the faces of those who listened, the slow realization that the salary trap is a choice, not a destiny. She was 75 years old. She had won the gamble by walking away from the table, and she was finally ready to live. She breathed in the air of the city, a billionaire of authenticity, knowing that the salary was gone, the position was dead, and the gold was liquidated. And for the first time in her life, she was truly success. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The Grand Ballroom was a masterpiece of cold, unyielding architecture, with the very walls seeming to demand a specific type of executive presence. Lydia watched the waitstaff move with the precision of gears in a watch, their identity suppressed to maintain the atmospheric portrait of the evening. She realized that she was no different from them. She was just a more expensive component in Reginald's machine. She remembered a night 40 years ago, a gala celebrating the merger that made Reginald a titan of industry. She had been tasked with managing the wives of the other board members, a strategic objective that required her to practice loss aversion toward her own opinions. She had avoided the loss of his professional standing by smiling when she was bored, nodding when she disagreed, and becoming a master negation for her own soul. She saw the hindsight in those faces now, the dozens of women who had made the same identity trade, all of them living in a golden cage and calling it success. They were billionaires of social debt, possessing every luxury imaginable but having no authority over their own lives. Lydia felt the urgency to stand up and scream, to break the atmospheric order with a single honest word, but the salary trap of status had taught her that silence was the only asset she was allowed to keep. She walked to the terrace, the air of the city tasting of exhaust and ambition. She thought about the financial topic of her marriage contract, the prenuptial agreement that treated her presence as a managed asset. Reginald had practiced loss aversion toward his wealth from day one, ensuring that even if the marriage failed, his net worth would remain intact. He had negotiated the terms of their intimacy as if it were a corporate merger, stripping the atmosphere of romance until all that remained was a transactional arrangement. Lydia saw the ironic trade in the city lights. Thousands of couples were currently signing similar contracts, trading their identity for a salary of security, never realizing that the price was their capacity to truly love. She was a 75-year-old billionaire of worthless gold, finally admitting that security is the most expensive fake goal a human can pursue. She felt the fear of a woman who had won the status but lost a life, a realization that hit her with the weight of 50 years of silent nights. She saw the hindsight in the dark water of the river. It was deep, cold, and utterly indifferent to her public image. If you're enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The realization that her entire life was a fake life began to erode the final pillars of her professional mask. Lydia returned to the ballroom, but the music now sounded like a warning, and the laughter sounded like negation. She saw Reginald across the room, his executive presence, a shield that kept the real life out. He was a billionaire of technical data, a man who could calculate the risk of a market shift but couldn't recognize the crisis in his own wife's eyes. She realized that the identity trade she had made 50 years ago was not a single event, but a daily gamble she had been losing for 18,000 days. She had negotiated away her vulnerability to protect authority, becoming a successful stranger in a world of worthless gold. She saw the hindsight as a sharp, surgical light. She had provided the atmosphere for success while her own soul was suffocating in the vacuum. She was ready to live, even if it meant liquidating every asset of her reputation to buy back a single hour of authentic presence. The morning after the final gala was a sensory reckoning. Lydia sat in the solarium, the sun illuminating the worthless gold of the antique clocks and the crystal vases. Each object was a physical ledger of a moment she had been absent from her own life. She remembered the purchase of the Ming vase in the corner. It was a strategic bribe Reginald had given her after missing their 20th anniversary. He had practiced loss aversion toward her resentment, using luxury as a tool for negation. She saw the ironic trade now. She had traded the atmosphere of a shared life for a collection of static objects. She was a billionaire of empty provision, finally admitting that the salary of status was a chain she had chosen to wear. She felt the urgency to break the walls, to turn the secret fortune of her regret into a public liquidation of the golden cage. She called her daughter Clarissa not to manage the schedule, but to deliver a surprising revelation. Clarissa arrived with the executive presence of someone who was already drowning in the salary trap. She spoke of her own strategic objectives and her social obligations, her voice a cold mirror of Lydia's 50-year identity trade. Lydia looked at her daughter and saw the physical cost of the gamble, the tension in her jaw, the hollow look in her eyes, the professional defense that kept everyone, even her mother, at a distance. "Clarissa, look at this house," Lydia said, her voice heavy with wise hindsight. "This is not a home. It is an atmospheric portrait of a fake life. I have spent 50 years being a social accessory for your father, and now I am a billionaire of nothingness. Don't trade your soul for the same worthless gold. Don't wait until you are 75 to speak up against the salary trap of status." The shock in Clarissa's eyes was the first real thing Lydia had seen in years. It was a mentor's warning that had finally bypassed the professional filter of her daughter's life. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The confrontation with Clarissa led to a shared vulnerability that shattered the atmospheric order of the penthouse. They spent hours on the floor of the solarium, surrounded by the worthless gold, and for the first time they spoke of identity and presence. Lydia spoke of the artist she had loved, the girl who had disappeared into the salary trap, and the fear that had kept her in the golden cage. Clarissa spoke of her own identity trade, the way she had negotiated away her joy to fund a public image that made her miserable. They were two women of identity retrieval, finally understanding that success is a road to nowhere if you don't have authority to be yourself. Lydia realized that the financial topic of their life was a fake goal, and that the only real asset was a presence they were finally sharing. She felt the urgency to liquidate her status to protect her daughter's future, a strategic move that the salary trap would never understand. The psychological liquidation of her social identity was the most difficult strategy Lydia had ever executed. She had to negate 50 years of external validation and public standing. She watched as her social circle, the successful strangers she had cultivated, began to distance themselves from her as news of her rebellion spread. They practiced loss aversion toward their own reputations, terrified that her insignificance would be contagious. Lydia saw the hindsight in their withdrawal. They were only present as long as the worthless gold was shining. Without the status, she was invisible to them, and the realization was a surprising revelation of her own freedom. She was no longer a component in the machine. She was a billionaire of authentic solitude, finally understanding that the salary of prestige was a price she was no longer willing to pay. She felt a surge of vitality as she prepared to leave the penthouse, a physical reaction to the removal of the golden cage. She walked through the penthouse one last time, her footsteps no longer practicing the atmospheric order of the perfect hostess. She saw the worthless gold for what it truly was, a collection of static assets that failed to provide significance. She thought about the identity trade she had made every day at the dinner table, the way she had managed her own spirit to fund Reginald's executive presence. She was a 75-year-old billionaire's second chances, finally admitting that success is the ability to walk through your own life and recognize the person you are. She was ready to live, and the salary trap of status had finally lost its hold on her identity. She left the keys on the mahogany sideboard, a final decision that was her most strategic move in 50 years. She was a billionaire of simple truths, standing in the hallway at the end, and finally knowing the worthless gold was behind her. As Lydia stepped out into the city air, she felt the presence of the real life rushing to meet her. She was a 75-year-old woman with a single suitcase and a secret fortune of truth. She saw the hindsight in the city lights. The salary trap was everywhere, but she was finally free. She was winning the gamble by walking away from the table, realizing that the status was a lie and the home was the person you are when no one is watching. She was home, and for the first time in her life, the home wasn't empty. It was filled with the atmosphere of her own identity. Stop trading your soul for a salary. Don't gamble your life on a future that doesn't exist. Reclaim your heart today. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell.